Our second reader is the author of the novel The Tale of the Teller of Tales and the play Frank Talk About Matters Big and Small. His sketchbook, Writers I Have Loved, has been featured on the Huffington Post, print magazine's blog, as well as the Paris Review blog. And then the normal stuff. He lives in a suburb at the edge of the city. You may have seen him. He works at a job at a company. Please welcome Joshua Landsman.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew and Eden, especially for having me back a second time. So I guess the first time must not have been that bad. This is from my novel, The Tale of the Teller of Tales. Copies available. It's about a teller of tales, a fabulist, who is invited by the king of a distant country that no one's ever heard of to come there and use his fables to reform the character of the prince, who is a little dissolute. But things go south pretty quickly, and this is one of the fables that the fabulist tells to try and save his skin. It's called The King, the Telescope, and the Face of God. A mighty king, bored by his earthly power, which extended over a limitless empire and the lives and deaths of countless subjects, acquired a telescope through which one could see the face of God. It came with these instructions. 1. Construct a tripod from the bones of long-dead hermits, monks, martyrs, and saints. Easy enough, thought the king. 2. Place the telescope on the tripod in the middle of a boundless desert. Build around it a labyrinth so vast a man could wander its passages for years without ever retracing his steps. Thought the king. That's a little more challenging, but if anyone can do it, it's me. 3. When the labyrinth is completed, kill the architect who designed it, as well as anyone with knowledge of its design. I like this part, thought the king, who was a bloodthirsty sort. You can't let the royal architect know about it, though. 4. Enter the labyrinth, whose single entrance should be the same as its single exit, and search for the telescope. But once it is found, if it is found, do not look into it until the night of a celestial syzygy, when the 5 planets are in perfect alignment. For if the telescope is looked into at any time other than during the syzygy, the lens will distort and show not the face of God, but a vision of hell, so frightening anyone who sees it will be driven mad. 5. At the height of the syzygy, gaze through the telescope along the line of the planets, and behold the face of God. The king summoned the royal astronomer. When is the next syzygy? He asked. The astronomer answered, in 43 years, 7 months, 21 days, 12 hours, and 39 seconds, O mighty one. Not much time, said the king. We'd better get started right away. The king's armies were dispatched to the ends of the earth to gather the bones of long-dead hermits, monks, martyrs, and saints. In doing so, they fought many wars, destroyed many holy shrines, and slaughtered many priests and defenders of their faiths. When enough bones had been gathered for 10,000 tripods, the most skilled craftsmen and artisans in the kingdom fashioned a magnificent one. It was truly a marvel to look upon. It was intricately wrought, delicately filigreed with astronomical and astrological symbols, and finely calibrated. The telescope was affixed to the tripod, and together they were carried to the center of the great southern desert, where work was begun immediately on the labyrinth. This was a colossal undertaking. It required the felling of entire forests that had stood since the beginning of time, and the quarrying to rubble of entire mountain ranges. For years, every inhabitant of the kingdom was occupied in building the labyrinth. Even the women who wove tapestries and rugs for its endless walls and floors, and the children who were set to menial tasks, such as carrying away debris and digging out the latrines. A vast city sprang up at the edge of the labyrinth, which itself grew so large it dwarfed this city and all others in the kingdom, including the capital. Messengers arrived in the capital every hour with reports for the king on the labyrinth's progress. The syzygy was fast approaching. And if the labyrinth was not completed soon, there likely wouldn't be time for the king's slaves to discover the path to the telescope chamber. Being careful, of course, not to look through the telescope once they found it, lest they be driven mad by a vision of hell. The king, who had not been young when he acquired the telescope, was now quite old and enfeebled. No one knew whether he would live long enough to see the labyrinth completed, let alone to see the face of God. What was worse, his eyesight was failing, despite the extraordinary efforts of the Royal College of Physicians, who every morning at the king's command transplanted into his head a fresh pair of eyes plucked from a newborn baby. There was much whispering in the kingdom about the vanity of a king who went to such lengths to look upon the face of God, when any day now he would be standing before him to be judged. But of course no one dared voice these sentiments too loudly, for the king's spies were everywhere. Still, risking death, a handful of the royal physicians formed a secret society called the Society of the Innocent, which they dedicated to the care of the unfortunate eyeless babies whom they saw as special victims of the king's arrogance and cruelty. How many thousands perished in the building of the labyrinth? Their bones were crushed to powder and mixed into the mortar that bound the labyrinth's bricks. How many thousands more were slain when the labyrinth was finally completed exactly 1 year before the syzygy? That night, the streets of Labyrinthium, as the city at the entrance to the labyrinth had come to be called, ran red with the blood of all those who had ever seen any of the royal architect's drawings, which themselves were so numerous they filled an entire library. The library was burned to the ground in a fire so large and bright it could be seen at night in the far-off capital by the royal architect's wife, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who did not know they were watching his funeral pyre. Thousands of slaves then streamed into the labyrinth with instructions to find the telescope or die. The king was moved on a golden palanquin to Labyrinthium, where he anxiously awaited word of success. Night after night, he waited in vain, and his rage grew so great he would allow no one to be in his presence. Could it be that after all he had done, the syzygy would pass with the telescope still lost within the labyrinth? It was unthinkable. Everyone in Labyrinthium who could walk was sent into the labyrinth to search, and at last, as the sun was setting to begin the very night of the syzygy, the great bell at the labyrinth's single entrance rang out. The telescope had been found. The king was rushed on his palanquin to the labyrinth. Yet once inside, the passages were so crowded the palanquin could barely move. "Out of the way!" cried the captain of the guard, slashing with his sword. "Forward!" he cried, whipping the palanquin bearers, and in their headlong rush, they trampled everyone before them, so that the king was literally borne along on the backs of his people. When a bearer became exhausted or died from a burst heart, a new bearer took his place to carry the king ever deeper into the labyrinth, on and on. It was now after midnight, but the palanquin was still many miles from the telescope. "Faster!" shouted the captain, "faster!" And then a further difficulty arose. The royal architect had known what was to be his fate once the labyrinth was completed, and he built along the route to its center a series of booby traps in order to avenge himself from beyond the grave. Bottomless pits opened in the floor, and the palanquin nearly tumbled in. Huge stones fell out of the ceiling, crushing many of the royal guard, but narrowly missing the palanquin. And walls collapsed in great rolling waves. But the palanquin with the king raced on. At last, just as the syzygy was nearing its most perfect linearity, the palanquin arrived at the labyrinth's central chamber. The captain of the guard lifted up the king and set him before the telescope. The king reached for it with gnarled fingers trembling from greed and aimed it through a viewing hole in the ceiling directly above. He put his eye to the eyepiece, and there in the lens were the 5 visible planets lined up in the night sky like a glowing pointer. But beyond the last planet, he saw no face of God, no face of any kind, nor even a vision of hell. He saw only stars. "It's a cheat!" cried the king. "I've been cheated!" "What is it, sire?" said the captain of the guard. "There's nothing. cried the king, his eyes still pressed to the eyepiece. I see nothing. Try the focus, suggested the captain, and the king twisted a series of knobs. Suddenly, the planets were blotted out by a soft, round, white blur. Ah, said the king. He focused in. Then he whispered, no, no, it can't be. What do you see, sire? Said the captain of the guard. But instead of answering, the king shrieked horribly, staggered backward, and fell. Sire, the captain shouted, rushing to where the king lay face down. He turned the king over, and the eyes that looked up at him were empty as the void, the eyes of a hopeless madman. Blue, whispered the king. No, I think green this morning. Or brown? The captain let the king's head drop. So, he thought, they were too late after all. He turned and looked at the telescope. Was there any vision of hell he could see through it that would be worse than the countless battlefields on which he'd stood in waist-deep gore, cutting men to pieces even as he looked forward to ravishing and cutting to pieces their wives and daughters and slaughtering their sons as well? And should hell be worse, wasn't that more reason to look now, since no doubt he would find himself there when his time came? At least he would know what to expect. He rose and peered through the telescope. But to his surprise, the planets were still in alignment. The syzygy was not over after all. Yet he too saw no face of God. He saw only the line of glowing planets, and beyond them a sea of stars. Meanwhile, on the roof of the labyrinth, directly above the telescope, two physicians from the Society of the Innocent were looking down through the viewing hole at the captain of the guard and the telescope. He might see you, whispered one of the physicians. Don't worry, said the other. It's over. He was holding the newborn baby, whose eyes had been plucked from their sockets that very morning and transplanted into the head of the king. Tenderly he pulled the blankets closer about the baby, for a cool wind had begun to blow in this hour before dawn. You did well, little one, he said, and softly kissed the eyeless baby's cheek. Now let's go home.